Welcome to this week's episode of Promising Young Surgeon. Today, we're going to talk about organizational dynamics, or more plainly, how to avoid getting screwed by the system. We've had Colin on the podcast before to talk about a few different strategies to employ at work. First, looking through the framework of the Gervais Principle to better understand organizational dynamics and how different groups interact with each other. And then second, to discuss the topic of mediocrity and how to best employ your own resources to maximize your effectiveness. If you have not heard one of these before, Colin is my husband, so he does not have a fancy long intro. It would probably be too biased. For this episode, we're going to return to another portion of the Gervais Principle and examine how organizations are designed and how to best navigate them. Hopefully, some of you have heard me say Gervais Principle, and that made your ears perk up. But if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll give you a quick primer before we get going. I will say thank you for being here today, Colin, even though you have to be here, because, again, when you invite your spouse, then they don't really have a choice.
Yeah, that's all right. Happy to be here.
So, the Gervais Principle was developed by a gentleman named Venkatesh Rao. He's an engineer by trade, but he got semi-internet famous for creating a blog called Ribbon Farm. I highly recommend checking it out. Overall, really just a brilliant guy. He does such a great job of taking these super complex ideas and making them legible for general audiences. The Gervais Principle is named for Ricky Gervais, the creator of the original UK version of The Office, but this is based around the US version that, most of us know. And it's a pretty complete analysis of organizational dynamics and how people interact within an organization, using The Office as the primary framework. Here's what you need to know to follow along for today's discussion. So in this theory, organizations create an individual Darwinism, or a dog-eat-dog kind of scenario, where rugged capitalism is king. This is not about any one specific industry. It generally holds true for large organizations, which absolutely and especially includes healthcare. Within any organization, there are three categories of people: sociopaths, losers, and the clueless. Sociopaths are at the top, and they drive the organization to function despite itself. The clueless people are the middle managers, or quote unquote, the company men. And the losers are not quote unquote losers in a social sense, but in an economic sense. So they may in fact be the coolest people in the organization, but they have made a bad economic deal, either willingly or unwillingly. They have traded the potential for very high earning for a steady paycheck. Sometimes people simply have to make this deal due to economic or social factors. But here's how the three groups all interact. There are multiple types of communication that happen within an organization, and that all relates to the types of people involved, right? Like the players who are at hand in any given conversation. And for kind of simplicity and ease of explanation, we are imagining like a two-party conversation. So first, you have power talk. This is the in-group language of sociopaths. Power talk is defined by whether or not there are stakes. So this would not be like two executives discussing the weather with each other, but maybe two higher ups feeling each other out or trying to suss out information from each other to use for their own gain. Next, you have posture talk. This is the language spoken by the clueless to everyone else. They think that it's power talk, but since they don't have any real power, it's actually posture talk. And then finally, there's baby talk. This is spoken by sociopaths and losers to the clueless. It sounds like power talk to the clueless, but it essentially is just the other person humoring them. And then the last group is game talk. This is the in-group language of the losers. And this is what people refer to as shop talk. It can have a lot of inside jokes. There can even be some stakes within the social dynamics of the loser group, but it really doesn't do anything other than reinforce the group mentality. There is, of course, one missing link here, which is the sociopaths to losers. They rarely speak directly in real life. So often this is just when it happens, it's a super direct form of communication. Think of the CEO delivering a town hall to all the employees. They just pretty much say what they want to say. So those are the basics and a quick overview of the Gervais Principle. And using the office as the example, David Wallace would be a sociopath, Michael Scott is a clueless, and pretty much everyone else is a loser, like Kevin, Stanley, Pam. We won't spend too much more time talking through this specifically, but it's really important to have that framework and set of definitions because we will use these terms throughout the rest of the discussion. If you want to hear any more about this specifically, definitely check out the earlier episode that goes into much more depth about the Gervais Principle. Does that all sound about right, Colin?
Yep, you nailed it.
Perfect. Okay, well, I officially welcome you on. You know, as usual, we are recording from the same house, but in different rooms. And as always, our dog has chosen to stay with me.
I don't see him in the frame this time. Maybe he's trying to bust into my door up here. Is he there? Maybe he's outside.
He's literally just asleep on the ground behind
right next
me.
to you? Oh, I can't see him.
That's crazy that you would even question this, but I'll
yeah,
scoot out of the way.
him.
Everyone can see the baby is happily asleep in here with me.
All right, that's a bummer.
So let's dive into today's topic. We have covered how to navigate interpersonal issues within an organization, but today we're just looking more broadly at how organizations themselves are designed and what you can look out for. Because some of the things, you know, that we talk about today won't necessarily just have a straightforward solution or like an easy hack, right? But the idea is for you to have a peek behind the curtain so that you won't be confused or frustrated when certain things happen in the workplace. And, you know, in reality, you can't even start to play a game when you don't even know the rules. So let's start with what we're going to call today, heads I win, tails you lose.
We're going to talk about like a few different things here, but the kind of main principle to get started with here is essentially that pretty much everyone wants to take more credit than is deserved for success, and they want to take less than their fair share of blame for failure. So this is pretty like inherent. This isn't just workplace stuff. I mean, I'm sure this happens pretty much everywhere, right? I mean, you would see this in kids all the time, right? Everyone wants to blame, you know, the other kid for something, but, you know, they're more than willing to take all of the credit when it works out. You know, people generally overestimate their ability. So the math doesn't quite work out, right? Like if something goes right, they assume, oh, I had a really big hand in that. Give me as much of the credit as possible. But if it went wrong, you know, they're much more likely to blame other factors. You know, timing was wrong. So-and-so screwed up. Just, you know, wasn't in the cards, whatever it is. So you have this kind of unequal share, imbalance of people trying to take credit, but then not, you know, taking the share of the blame. So, you know, this plays out differently kind of depending on where you are in this hierarchy. So when we talk through, you know, the sociopath, clueless, loser, it's going to play out differently, kind of depending on which type of person you are within that organization. So to give some kind of like clear examples here, like within the office, probably the most classic one is they come up with that golden ticket idea. They're, you know, Michael wants to rip off Willy Wonka and put golden tickets like in paper reams, and then the 5 customers that find them get some huge discount. And then when it goes poorly and David Wallace is yelling about it because they have to give this huge discount, Dwight is willing to step in and like fall on the sword. He's like, oh, it's my fault. You know, it was my idea. And Michael's happy to sort of offer him up for that.
And so, you know, in this scene specifically, if you guys don't watch The Office, basically he does the 5 golden ticket scenario, but instead of actually like parsing them out, he put all 5 like on the same pallet. So they all go to the same huge company that's like their biggest client, you know? And so now, because of like an additive effect of all those % discounts, their biggest client got a massive discount. That's like what David Wallace specifically is mad about. And, you know, Michael Scott, clueless level guy, he didn't really think through like making sure that they were spread across different orders.
Right. And then basically what I think what happens is that that company's like so thrilled with the discount that they place another huge order and they become like an even better customer.
Mm-hmm.
So then David Wallace kind of reverses and is like, oh, never mind. Like that was an amazing idea. Let me recognize Dwight for that, since it was, such a great call by him. And then obviously Michael is then upset about it. He tries to get Dwight to sort of go back on it. Dwight will not give up, ownership of the idea. And they sort of go back and forth until, Michael basically just blurts it out and says, nope, it was my idea. Dwight was going to take the blame for it. And essentially David Wallace just blames both of them then, and then gets to take the credit for himself. So, these are two examples of two people who kind of don't see the bigger picture. They find themselves falling into this like heads I win, tails you lose situation. And they don't know how to navigate it. Whereas David Wallace basically, he didn't necessarily set this one up, but the assumption is that he probably went to Michael at some point and said, hey, we're trying to do something to incentivize sales. Why don't you come up with some ideas? Michael takes it a little bit too far. And if it hadn't worked out and they had screwed it up, well, then David Wallace could have just blamed Michael and, it's off of his hands, no problem. But then obviously when it works out, those two blow it. Michael's not able to leverage it for a better position or anything down the line. And so David can just kind of bring that tire up and say, yep, anyway, they kind of messed up down there at the regional branch, but it was a great idea by me to have them do that. So win-win for everyone. So you can kind of see, just the differences of like trying to, navigate this when you fall into it versus kind of seeing the bigger picture and like having the ability to manipulate it a little bit.
And to do a spin zone, because you definitely cannot spin zone if you are looking, kind of with blinders on, or if you're too preoccupied just with maybe like the mechanics of what happened, but you don't see the whole board, then you don't even have a chance at a spin zone. But please share an example of one for like the loser class.
Yeah, so this is it's almost like the reverse of it a little bit. Because this is, so it's when like Dunder Mifflin is failing and they have this big shareholder meeting, and they try to trot out Michael as this, savior. He has the best branch there. Turns out, Michael has no idea what he's talking about. And he sort of blurts out to all the shareholders that like they're going to fix everything. So there's all the hullabaloo in the back rooms there, and Oscar comes up to Michael and says, hey, I actually think I have a plan from like an accounting standpoint where we might be able to get out of this. And he's trying to feed it to Michael. He's like, why don't you present this to the executives and, you go be the champion of it. Michael doesn't quite understand it. So he just brings Oscar in, is like, Oscar has an idea to save the company. And immediately Oscar just kind of weasels his way out. And he says, oh, no, I don't want to deal with that. Right. Because he went from kind of the position that we were just talking about that David Wallace was in, where he is sort of fathering an idea and he can have Michael champion it. So if it does fail, well, Michael was the one who said it. But if it does work, great, Michael gets some credit, but then also Oscar can kind of be like the architect of it behind the scenes. But knowing that he would have to be the one to speak up and say it, he kind of chickens out, right? Because he doesn't want to take that big risk that a sociopath might take, where there could be huge reward, right? I mean, that could have worked out, literally saved the company, and then Oscar gets a huge promotion, but he wasn't ready for that risk. So he just kind of backs off and says, I would rather, play it safe and not get involved in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that when we contrast it here with like this third method, which is the sociopath method, that group, kind of one of their perhaps defining characteristics is that they won't let a heads I win, tails you lose scenario happen to them, right? Like they'll engineer it so that they cannot be at fault.
Right. So this is kind of the like prevailing difference between a sociopath versus everyone else, right? They are always trying to look ahead and make sure that they don't fall into one of these traps where they're forced to either make a big decision or do something like Oscar and just sort of back out, potentially like letting someone else take the credit. So yeah, like you said, they're basically thinking ahead to try and engineer these situations. Because essentially, if something like we kind of talked about at the beginning, like if something fails, most people they're not super likely to just say, oh, it was that one person, that was the whole thing. Often people are pretty okay with just chopping it up to either incompetence or, just something wasn't right? The environment wasn't there for it. So they can basically set up a situation where if it does fail, they can either feign incompetence. So they can kind of say, oh, I handed it off to this person because that's not my expertise, right? I'm the delegator. That's their job. So even though they might have known that probably wasn't the best person for it, they can still hand it off because they're not super sure about doing it themselves. So they can say, oh, our bad, right? Or they can sort of say, oh, that person was incompetent, right? I thought they were going to be good. That's why I gave them responsibility. Turns out they were incompetent. I need to fire them. You don't have to fire me. It was their fault, right?
And I really like thinking about ways that this plays out for us in the hospital, like for anyone who has been a resident or around a residency program. Basically, there's this example where certainly in my program and in many others, residents create the daily schedule. Because, and you could say, so if you were a sociopath at the top, you'd say residents should be the ones who create the daily schedule because they're on the ground floor and they understand it better. And of course, that does mean that you are getting nearly free work from them as opposed to having like an administrative professional do this job, which definitely takes concerted effort and a real time investment. But basically, if that system works out, great. And if it doesn't work out, it's the resident's fault who's making that daily schedule.
Right. And then they can basically say, well, so if another attending came to the chair or the program director, whoever, and said, hey, my clinic just went uncovered today. I didn't hear anything about it. They'd say, well, that's that chief's fault. They're the one who's making the schedule. When in reality, that should probably not be that person's job, right? There should be a dedicated person for it. So they can kind of wash their hands of it and say, well, is that other person that was incompetent? Yes, maybe I'm ultimately responsible for these schedules, but I tried to delegate to them. I thought they were up for the task. Apparently they're not.
Yeah. And another a corollary of that is where a lot of places they'll have a rule that says well, all clinics have to be covered, right? And if it violates a resident's duty hours, then at the sociopath level, you're protected. You'd be like, I never told them to misrepresent their hours. And of course, I really respect the duty hours. But yet there's almost this, there's this secondary conversation happening, which is X and Y and Z all have to be covered. And of course, I don't care what it takes to get those all covered.
Yeah, right. So that's kind of the other option for a sociopath is, you can claim ignorance, right? So anyone in this example, right, who's running a residency program, they should be able to do pretty easy math and say, hey, if we literally have every clinic covered and then people are on call this amount and we have this many surgeries coming in, there's almost definitely someone who's going to go over 80 hours. That's pretty unavoidable. But they just don't write that down anywhere. They don't say that to anyone. And they create that rule that says everything has to go covered. And obviously there's sort of that there might even be a spoken rule that's hey, if you're coming close to duty hours, of course you can come talk to me, you can report it, but it's with the understanding that well, that's gonna ding you, right? We're gonna kind of put that in your record that you're not up for the task. So
one that I see actually that jogs my memory because one that I have witnessed this just in terms of I've been a third party observer where when that does happen, then now you've got people's attention and you've got a target on your back because maybe your time management isn't good. I don't know why your hours would be approaching the limit of hours because other people don't have that problem. They get their notes done on time. They don't need that extra time logged at the hospital,
Right. There's always a way to sort of spin it negatively there. Yeah. And then, if this, let's say it does turn into a legitimate violation, the ACGME hears about it or whoever, it gets reported. It's really easy for the program director to say, oh, of course, we never told them to do that. In fact, we told them the opposite. We told them if they're getting close to the limit, you need to come to us and tell us. We never want them to misrepresent their hours. We just told them that all clinics have to go covered. Right. So you have this in order that could potentially, create some sketchy violations there, but they get to keep their hands clean because if it does come to light, there's really nothing tracing it back to them that had that person actually violate anything.
Yes. And the person who's violating it, again, it just comes back to personal or moral failure on their part. And so it's a very well-designed kind of unwinnable setup. And so basically, if someone wants something to actually happen, then they give autonomy in an area where the person is strongest. And if they want an engineered failure, than they give autonomy in an area where they're the weakest. And we definitely see even examples of that play out in residency.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly what I was just thinking there. Because it's so easy to catch someone up in residency. Like a resident has, so many other little duties going on. And if you know that this person is going to struggle with X, Y, and Z, well, okay, let's give them an extra task on that, right? And you can easily frame that as, oh, we want to give you some more responsibility here. We think you're doing a great job, knowing that this is going to cause like some serious stress on them, and it's probably going to fail. Great, maybe that's the result that they wanted. They want to push someone out. So it's really easy to engineer those if you're in that position. In terms of like what you can do to stop this stuff from happening, it's really not very straightforward, right? Because in some cases, especially in residency, like a lot of times there might not be great ways to deal with this, but like it goes a little bit back to that kind of mediocrity conversation that we have about, really being like lean with your resources and understanding that, if you can see this type of stuff coming, right? If you're questioning, like, why did I get this responsibility, right? Like they kind of know that I'm not that good at this. What's going on here? Okay, you need to find time to slack off in a different area where the spotlight's not on you. Like that maybe sounds a little bad, but that's probably some of the best way to kind of judo this and get around it. Because obviously you're at a serious disadvantage if someone is like creating the scenario for you. Because again, if you do it correctly, you don't really get any credit. You just did what you're supposed to do. It's the person who set that potentially is going to get all the credit for it, but you will get all of the blame if you miss out on it.
Yes. And I think that like that. So if I had to distill it down, it's just like if things go right, and this is not only true of residents, but like honestly, I think people in a lot of professional fields, if you are anyone other than the sociopath at the top, when things go right, you're not going to get the credit for that. And when things go wrong, you will get the blame for it. So it just really, I think that it is an important thing to kind of like understand structurally and like philosophically, because it also may help you feel a little bit more free and maybe less attached to outcomes even, or certainly less attached to feedback. Like obviously Colin and I are not like, this is the dream workplace. This is like, if we built a utopia, it'd have this system. Like not at all. It's just much more about, please open your eyes to the work dynamics that you experience now, because to not do so is only to your detriment. And basically, to just kind of tie up that whole section, the clueless and the losers are going to have to deal with whether or not the ends justify the means. And the sociopaths are going to be using whatever methods that they need to keep themselves well covered.
Right. And that's kind of what you need to know as like, if you're in that loser class, right? Like that sociopath, they probably don't really care, right? There is like a immorality to it that, potentially creates a little bit of a race to the bottom. But that honestly, that sometimes is the opportunity to sort of make that jump from like a loser to a sociopath, right? If you can play that game correctly and you can sort of signal that, oh, I see what's going on here, I'm going to like shift it somewhere else, or I'm going to twist this back around. That's potentially a way to get on someone's radar in a good way. We're obviously not advocating for like breaking the law or anything, but there is a way to kind of see what chess game is being played and then get on someone's radar in a good way.
Right. And that makes me think of like just this one specific instance of power talk where like technically power talk does not have to be between two sociopaths. Power talk can be any talk where there is power at hand, right? Like where there are stakes, like by definition. So there are stakes. That might be like a sociopath talking to a loser, kind of like what Colin's alluding to, because one of the examples of that in the Gervais Principle is when David Wallace has that house party pretty early on, and a bunch of people from the office are there. Jim is there, and he and Jim actually sneak away to kind of his backyard to just shoot hoops a little bit. He kind of says to Jim, he'd say like, hey, do you want to, just chill out for a second? And they're shooting hoops, and they have a casual conversation back there in which David Wallace, even inquires about, the Michael Scott Jan relationship, but like kind of casual, kind of over dribbling back and forth, whatever, passing back and forth. But that is a power talk situation. And it's handled very masterfully by Jim. I just say this because it's like, if you realize when power talk is happening, okay, maybe you can show up for that conversation differently, because Jim uses it to his advantage. And he basically like walks away from that interaction having gained some points in the eyes of a person whose opinion is important.
Right. Sociopaths are often looking for like other potential sociopaths that they can kind of promote and like bring up through the system. So like if you can show off, I mean, there's a reason. I'm sure this happens in a lot of residencies where there's like a hand-picked person and, you know, they're a favorite of a program director or a chair or something. And like, it's not always because they're good at this game. There might just be other, you know, dumb reasons for it. But like, I'm sure in a lot of cases, it is because at some point they sort of signaled that like, oh, I get it. I know how to like play this game here. And often that'll kind of let them get away with a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. So let's go through some of the methods that sociopaths or organizations in general can use to get what they want. These are things that may be happening right now in your organization that you may or may not be aware of. First, we have the divide and conquer method.
Yeah, so this one is like relatively straightforward. And it's going to look pretty different, like depending on the type of organization you're in, like where you are sort of in that organization. But the idea is to basically use like tensions or breakpoints within groups to exploit the losers to get what they want, essentially. Right. So like a pretty clean residency example would be a program director. You know, they're trying to gather dirt on like a junior resident who's not doing very well. They're not necessarily just going to go around to everyone and say, hey, I want all of this information reported back to me, right? Because that's going to get back to that junior. They're going to kind of know what's going on. But what they might realize is that there is a senior resident who clearly does not like that junior already, right? That senior doesn't necessarily have the power to do anything about it, but they can use that senior resident who doesn't like the junior, and they can kind of hint to him like, hey, I'd like to gather a little more information. You know, I'm with you. I'm a little concerned about Johnny over here. You know, if at any point you want to let me know about stuff that's going on with that, you know, I'd be happy to talk it through with you. And that way they can use that other person to like sow the seeds of doubt there, and they can actually start like building the file against them.
Exactly. And I'm sure that happens like more than we all know. But of course, you're not going to be getting like a balanced opinion in that scenario where like the sample size was 1 and you pick someone who already you've heard doesn't like that other, you know, person. When we look at overall organization, they're designed to benefit certain people and squeeze out profits. And you might think that it'd be easiest to just be lean and autocratic so that the sociopath at the top can simply dictate whatever they want. But in fact, the opposite is true. And that's what's referred to as bureaucracy.
Yeah. So like hospital and healthcare systems are, you know, just some of the most bureaucratic organizations that exist. I mean, they're these massive sprawling groups that often have tons of competing interests, right? Like on the surface, you know, a hospital is there to provide the best care, but a lot of these hospitals are for profit, or even if they're not for profit, they still have to bring in a certain amount of money. You know, you have tons of different vested interests in terms of, you know, different groups within that. Maybe, you know, one group is shown some favoritism because they, you know, bring in more money or get more publicity or whatever it is. So constant like shifting balances in power within this. And there are just layers upon layers of people that like obscure kind of everything that's going on. There's also some like extra weird stuff in healthcare system in that you have these like very distinct levels. So like you have managers for, you know, staff for the hospital. That's one group. And you have managers for like nurses, you know, within the hospital, but they're also working in the same clinics as the doctors, but that doctor doesn't report to that same manager. And it's this weird thing because like, you know, the doctor's giving out orders on one day, but then technically they're not their boss. And it's all over the place. And oftentimes like it can be very difficult, I think, to figure out, okay, if there's an issue, like where does this go to, right? If it's not a straightforward kind of violation or whatever it is, if there's just an interpersonal issue or something, a lot of times it can be uncomfortable to, talk directly to someone. So you might feel that you need to run it up the chain, but then where does that go? Right. So in a sense, like organizations like this are basically designed to do certain things incompetently. And that sounds kind of dumb, but it makes sense in the sense that, there are really expensive things that would need to get done, especially within a healthcare system, right? If everyone was to just provide the absolute best care to everyone, they answered everyone's questions, they took as long as they needed in the visits, they put in all the orders they need, that would be really expensive, right? If they took in everyone who didn't have an insurance and sort of did whatever they need. And that's going to cut into profits. So rather than, again, just having someone at the top that says, no, yes, and it's just very plainly like what the rules are, this huge bureaucratic system can make it just super frustrating to the point where those things are really hard to get done. And a lot of times they just sort of drop off because it's kind of impossible to figure out like how to get to the end of it.
Exactly. And then I will just say really quickly, like super compounded by the revolving door effect of residency specifically, good luck trying to wade through everything obfuscated here, like Colin's describing. And then also even like being around long enough to even approach addressing some of it. And then even outside of residency, when people look at data for like attendings, I think it's something like 80% of ENTs do not stay at their first job after training.
Right. So, oftentimes the people that are going to be there the longest are those people at the top, or it's that kind of clueless class that is just happy with their position and they've been in that position for 20 years, right? And they know the ins and outs of the organization, or they think they do. And, those are the people that you have to go through to get anything done. And it's sort of being intentionally slowed down. And this might sound kind of obvious, but I feel like the biggest complaint for everyone involved in healthcare is just like, I can't believe how crazy this system is. I can't believe, it's so hard to get X, Y, and Z done. Just know that that stuff is basically done on purpose. So instead of just sort of blaming the system, it actually might help to look at the people involved a little bit and try and suss out what's happening, right? Like, what are the things that these people at the top are doing to keep this system working? And then how can I sort of work within that, right? Exactly. It's not just an empty system. Like, there are people pushing buttons in there.
And who is benefiting from the system being this way? Right, I think that question is the important one.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Because the more complicated the system is, the easier it is to make exceptions when it benefits someone. So if you're at the top and everyone just assumes that stuff doesn't get done on time and it might take months and months and months, it's really easy to just then sort of pull a lever because things aren't supposed to happen quickly. And so if you do, you might be doing a huge favor to someone else. You can get something back in return. And then on the flip side, it's really easy to deflect that blame because if they don't pull the lever or they intentionally slow it down even more, they can say, well, there's nothing I can really do about that, right? The system's crazy. I don't control this. There's so many people involved. I'm so sorry about that, right? I'm just following the rules here. Nothing else I can do.
And this totally is, it is funny because it's so extreme and kind of dramatic that you're like, okay, is this a conspiracy theory? It is not. It's not a conspiracy theory. I've been in ENT for 8 years now. I work in a hospital. I went to medical school before that. And anecdotally, there are scenarios where, let's say somebody at the sociopath level is I absolutely cannot do this. My hands are tied, right? The committee has spoken and the committee's just them. That's just, there's so many easy ways. I guess if I didn't want to take responsibility for an opinion or, preference that I had, I'd be it's crazy. The committee has spoken. And the committee is, I'll tell you guys, it's me and Beignet. So, when I say stuff like that, which I've never said before, but now I kind of am that sounds good. And I feel like maybe I could get out of stuff pretty easily that way. I'm just kidding. And I don't think it would work if I did it. But you can start to see how some of these things are being set up in a way that does not favor you.
Yeah. I mean, this is the equivalent of like, go ask mom, like knowing full well that mom is going to say no. And then mom would say, well, what did dad say? Well, okay. He said, ask me. Well, I don't know. We're going to have to talk to him. And you can just bounce it back and forth until they're like, well, I don't know. Neither of us could agree. So I guess you can't do it. Right. Like,
yes. And there's
that's basically what happens.
Because of the hierarchical nature of the hospital, plus like the fact that people's identities are so closely tied to it and how much time and effort and heart we all put into it there, it is very easy to slip into this other sinister thing, which is just like, like we're family, like we're like a family. And that's a very appealing excuse to kind of like underpay or undercredit or overwork people, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think like a core part of this too is that, people in this loser class tend to have like a real sense of honor, right? And some of that is due to like the group nature of a lot of this, right? Where you are with these people every day, you might have like actual relationships with them. So like you're really not trying to screw over people all the time. So oftentimes like they're just kind of willing to accept it, right? And they might say, well, all right, I mean, I guess I'll take the hit on this one, kind of knowing that like everyone else can see I'm doing this. Maybe it'll come back around. Maybe they'll help me out next time. But that sociopath at the top does not care, right? They're just like, I just want someone to take the blame. Don't care who it is. That's great. So like if you're, unfortunately, if you're being bogged down, by kind of the group dynamics and like relationships in your organization, it's very easy to take advantage of you. Like that's just kind of really what it is. It's not fair, but if you're dealing with someone, that is just trying to get the means to the end and they don't really care what they are, then, they're going to use any of these methods possible to kind of get done what they need to.
Yep. And I think that, just because it's relevant here, it's like at the start of The Office, US version, Jim is in the loser class, like 100%. And so that's to the point that we made earlier about how like that person could be extremely well liked. Like I would view him as popular in the office, stuff like that. Doesn't matter in this scenario and in institutional dynamics. He's part of the loser class. BJ Novak's character, Ryan. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Ryan of Ryan and Kelly, of course, famously. Ryan, he starts out as a loser when he's a temp. Guess what? By a couple seasons in, he's in the sociopath class.
Yeah, he becomes like the chief marketing officer or something, right? He makes that massive rise when everyone's like going for Jan's job.
Yeah, he gets an MBA, like there's turmoil. I mean, so he gets an MBA in night school. There's like all this turmoil. That's the job that like Michael and, Jim and Rashida Jones's character, Karen, they all go for it, right? And there's kind of like all this hullabaloo, all this chaos. And that literally makes me think of like Game of Thrones style, Littlefinger being like, chaos is not a pit. Chaos is a ladder. Because Ryan saw that. And like literally while everyone was just freaking out, they were doing their beach games, like competing for Michael's spot, Michael thinking he's going to get this job. It was just a disaster. Whole time, Ryan is positioning himself and then he goes in for this job. He's like the dark horse out of nowhere.
Well, and like they're always trying to pull Ryan into the crew, right? Like they're, Dwight and Michael or whoever. And he just like kind of resists the whole time and is like, I don't want to be involved. I don't want to be like a guy at the office. And then I think even in that same example, don't Jim and Karen both pull out because like they're going, I feel like
yes,
that's hard,
they
right?
pull out of beach games. Well, like at the end, at the hot coal walk, they are like, please take my name out of the running, Michael. I don't want your job. I'm going for that job.
But I think they might even pull out of the, like when they both go to interview, I think they both, I might be wrong, but I feel like Jim pulls his name out where even like he might seriously be in contention, but he says, oh, you know what? I'd actually, because, Karen's also going for it and I've got people back at the office and stuff like,
oh my gosh, that's cute. You think it's because Karen's going for it? It's because he's in love with Pam. It's because Pam sent a little note, like in his lunchbox, like in his files. Colin is not as well versed in the office lore, but that is why you're right. Jim does take his name formally out of the running when he's like meeting with David Wallace. Because I agree with you.
Probably would have given him the job.
Yeah, totally. But then like, because of Jim picking Pam and going back to the office. Okay, perfect. Now a tiny window appeared and like Ryan was there and he was ready. And like that guy has been scheming. Like he stays scheming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, like that, oftentimes those are the types of decisions you have to make. It's like, do you choose to, keep this relationship, or do you get what you want? Right. And like, if those are at odds, a lot of times you're not gonna be able to do both. And so, if you make the choice to keep the relationship, you got to know what's going on behind the scenes, and that might actually affect, whatever's happening, whether it's a new job or promotion or something.
I would love to hear, and again, I think Colin does a good job of this because like he sees the big picture. Like I am a very good example of maybe like the biggest loser who is traveling around. I have like a monocle for some reason, and I only look out that one eye. Like I don't even have depth perception. I'm not even using two eyes. Like when I go into some of these workplace scenarios, and for sure that was one of my problems and biggest weaknesses as a resident, like back in the day. And again, like, and I'm a person who's primarily like driven by an extremely rigid value system and all these principles and stuff. Again, just firmly entrenched in the loser class. Like, I think it'd be pretty easy to suss me out and figure out what the core values are and then appeal to one of them. And I'd be like, yeah, just kind of blindly walking through life. So if you had to kind of give some of the major takeaways and pearls, Colin, like, I want to hear about where you think that this system goes when it goes totally unchecked and off the rails. And then you have to give us something in terms of like, it can't all be doom and gloom and the system is built to beat us.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I guess like signs of this is probably things that most people are going to recognize, like, unfortunately, within their organization, right? I mean, this is what happens when you have this like very rugged capitalism, which is increasingly what organizations are in the US. So the first thing is going to be a serious decrease in morale, right? Like if you have a manager, an executive, whoever that is running a lot of these divide and conquers, and it's probably happening at multiple levels. So you're going to have decrease in morale at a manager level down to the kind of core staff worker level. It's just going to basically, like, these groups are sort of held together by some of this like game talk and these like actual kind of games that are played to really sort of reinforce this like sense of illegibility, right? So you've got 10 people on a team, and this is the same in the office, right? Like you wouldn't really be able to rank just the staff in the office, like 1 through 12, right? I mean, who's to say that like Phyllis is more important than Stanley or something, right? So like what keeps them all together is that like they don't really know their place, and that's kind of like that's to the benefit of everyone. But these divide and conquer methods actually create like a hierarchy within that, right? Like if they are trotting something out and they're trying to, get someone to screw someone else over, that might mean that it's actually quite obvious now that in like the sociopath's eyes, this person is more important than this person. And that's going to create, even more division like within that loser class. So there is going to be this like uneven accounting where people are continuing to try and take a bigger share of credit. But realistically, more blame is going to be sent around to everyone. And that's unfortunately probably how a lot of, places are managed, right? Where it's a lot of finger pointing. It's a lot of, just sort of passing it down the chain. And you have this like overgrowth of, blame to the point where everyone feels, you can feel that like uneven accounting. It seems like you're getting more blame than credit.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of the next level up, like this type of stuff really does reinforce like incompetence amongst the clueless class, because if sociopaths are constantly running these schemes where they're sending something down, creating these heads I win, tails you lose situations, it's actually in their best interest to keep someone incompetent there, right? Because if it doesn't work out, great. Again, you can blame them for being incompetent. That sociopath is not in danger of losing their job. If it does work out, they take credit for it. Rather than having someone really competent down there who could potentially take their position, they could spin this type of stuff against them, and it could put them in danger. So it is helpful to have someone incompetent in a lot of cases, especially if you know that there's even potentially competent people below them who are actually going to get the work done. That way they can kind of, ease the pressure down on that clueless class from themselves and kind of send that, down the works there. So, if you've got a really incompetent manager that's been there forever, it might be for a reason. And then, realistically, like these bureaucracies they just keep getting bigger and bigger. So, like we pointed out, the more complexity and, making it harder to sort of see through it, that only benefits the people at the top. So if what's going to happen is likely there's going to be more and more individual cases that don't fit into a bucket here, it becomes this kind of economy of like trading to where, okay, I know that if I just follow the proper chain of command that I go through this might take months and months and months, and then eventually it gets squashed at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cheat the system. I'm going to find the person who's sort of tuned in to this one specific thing, and I might make a deal with them, to where they can pass my case through this time if I do something later. And that's probably going to happen more and more, to the point where if you're not clued into the system, it might feel like it's impossible to get something done.
And you're like looking around wondering how other people get stuff done, maybe, or like why X or Y or Z was approved or made possible for someone else, but not for yourself, etc.
Yeah, right. And it just becomes very confusing, again, leading to a decrease in morale, right? Because it just seems like the system's broken and it doesn't make any sense. And why am I doing this work? It's by design, right? Like it actually, or even if it's not by design, it is helpful to people. So they're happy to keep going with it.
Yeah, it's not even, I don't even feel like it's as much that like people want you to lose as much as they're going to win, And so even like probably not taking it personally is probably an asset that will help like clear-headedness. But I guess my question is, what can people now do with like all this information? Like what can you do about it when you are starting at this point to like recognize the institutional dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a baseline level, it is just, keeping it very impersonal, right? Like your organization is not your friend, right? This is not,
and they're not your family.
Yeah, exactly, right? So like, of course you can be friends with people at work, but you have to have those priorities set, that if you're just happy, and that's sort of the point of this like loser class, right? There are a lot of people that are either just happy to show up and take their paycheck and go home, or they're not really willing to, make a move and sort of go beyond that. If that's okay, then there's really not much to do about this, other than it might create a little less, hand wringing, because maybe you can see through this a little bit, right? But if you are trying to make some moves and you're running into these roadblocks, it really is looking for like, what is this system optimized for, or who is this system optimized for? And then finding ways to connect directly with those people. It may and likely will mean at some point kind of tossing someone else aside, right? Like there is not, in almost all cases, a situation where just everyone is going to rise equally and it's all going to work great and everyone's going to get compensated fairly. That just kind of doesn't really happen, right? So if your number one goal is to like rise up through the ranks, or you're looking for this one specific promotion, even if you don't want to become CEO, you just want to get to a certain level, you need to find like the way through this kind of labyrinth here.
And the way through, the garbage.
Yeah. And it starts with recognizing like this day-to-day stuff, like these, don't get bogged down in the weeds, basically, right? Is I guess where I'm going with that is the, pitting two losers against each other, pitting two clueless against each other. It's a waste of time every time, right? Like you should never be battling someone sort of within your own class. You're always looking to like sort of level up.
No, you're right. That's a really good point. That like I think that sums up very importantly. Like, yeah, don't be a pawn in somebody else's game, right? Like battling within the loser class, like loser versus loser. Um, and then another example of it that I think was really helpful is like, yeah, I would come home venting about work. Like certainly in residency, a lot of these dynamics are like at the forefront. And I'd come home and I'd be like venting. And yes, number one, I feel like fairly frequently you would tell me you're in the weeds, so we're not going to do this, right? And that is helpful. Like that's actually a pretty good mantra. If you watch The Bachelor, then you've heard keep the main thing the main thing, that's like our new house slogan since last season. But the other example is like if somebody says something that really really hurts your feelings, like if somebody insults you, but they're just part of the Clueless class, that should hurt your feelings less. And like literally, it hurt my feelings less to kind of be reminded of that and be able to recognize it.
Yeah, and I think like maybe a common scenario too is when maybe you feel like you're being blocked by your manager or something, right? Maybe you have like a direct manager above you. They're not like in the executive team, but you have someone right above you that's sort of blocking, I don't know, whatever you're trying to do, right? Whether it's like get recognition or, get in line for this promotion. And I think it can be really easy to get bogged down in trying to like win that person over because, okay, they're mean to me, right? I got to figure out how to like not get yelled at by them. The way to sort of leap from loser into sociopath is to be able to sustain some of that heat for maybe a while focusing your energy on maneuvering around them, basically. So like finding out, okay, not what is going to like please this manager, but I need to try and gain enough information about, obviously something's happening to this manager, right? Maybe the person above them is coming down on them a ton, right? Because they're not meeting some sort of standard. So that person is then passing it on to you. You need to suss out like what is going to work. What can I do that is sort of like either undeniable, that's obviously going to get passed up, up to the top and it'll be very clear that it came from me, or how can I just hit the bare minimum of, what I'm being expected to do from this manager while then trying to maneuver onto another committee or another, group or something that might be able to, swing outside of that.
Yeah, and I would say that this last example that Colin's giving, that is how Jim plays the game in the office. Like he just really, he doesn't sweat too much like smaller projects or, like if a Clueless assigns him a task, he's like, okay. And he, maybe applies some of the principles of mediocrity, to and that approach to it. But then like where it counts, and again with the David Wallace stuff, like he shows up, like he makes those right strategic moves. Like at the end of the day, none of us can be firing on all cylinders 100% of the time. That's a quick way to flame out. And so, I think playing that masterfully is a big part of it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And I mean, really just like knowing is half the battle, right? Like just understanding when these things are being thrown at you and, how you can kind of dodge those is really what you're going to try to do.
I have one last pro that I want to share just from basically a conversation I was part of recently, and I learned a lot from it because basically a person was talking about, and this is like, a Zoom, whatever. This is like in a vacuum. A person is talking about an initiative they are trying to start. They tried to start it within their department. And so a very, concerted effort that this individual made, they actually got the okay to implement this new like thing, curriculum, well-being effort. And they got the okay to do it within this like, very small department. And then when it came closer, it actually got struck down. It was just like, the person who runs that, like, again, a small department was like, oh, change my mind. Like, we're not dedicating time to that. Like, you're out. And what was so interesting is that like one of the experienced veteran, like wise Yodas on the call was like, your primary problem is that you were thinking too small with that. Like you need to go back to the drawing board, then go to the institution on a way broader, way bigger level. And they'll probably work with you. Like this could be instituted on the on that broad of a level. And then guess what? One small person can't knock that down. Like it would no longer be at the whims of like, pretty much that's the equivalent of like this person who, struck it down, basically changed their mind about it within the small department. That's kind of a clueless actor, and I like that because I think that's a very impactful way to think about it, right? Is like, are you thinking too small about anything? That's what I would kind of encourage people to challenge themselves and ask themselves.
Yep, totally agree. I like that.
Okay, Colin. Well, as we're wrapping up here, I would love to hear what your favorite Taylor Swift album is and why.
Ooh. I guess I've always maintained my favorite one is Lover, which I feel like has very much fallen out of favor. I don't think anybody even likes that album anymore. But it was probably the first one that I really listened to seriously with you. I mean, I didn't really listen to Taylor Swift at all before we got together. And I guess Reputation came out when we first started dating. Or was that
like around 1 year? We've been dating like a year, and that was the first album to come out. Yep, since we met.
Yeah, I think that one's a little too it was a little too flashy even at the time for me. Like there's some fun songs on there, but it's very
I love
medium pop. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think Lover has a very good mix of just like pretty fun upbeat songs, but then I think it has some of her best just like songwriting on it as well. Plus, it's just like a kind of a fun era, right? And I connected to us as well. I mean, that was like in the thick of residency, so it's kind of a nice reprieve from that. Yeah, I don't know, top to bottom, that's probably the one I come back to most.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I know. We're like almost a house divided because I'm always, I'm like still kind of in my Midnights era. It is October now, so like I'm very much in the Folklore era. But anyway, we definitely have a deep appreciation for kind of her whole discography. So thank you again for being here, Colin. It's always great to chat strategy with you.
Yeah, of course. Hope it helped.
Follow me on Instagram at francismay.md and at Rethinking Residency. Visit my website, rethinkingresidency.com, to learn more about physician stories and ways that residents can most effectively navigate the game of residency. I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode of Promising Young Surgeon. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please subscribe and leave us a review. Feel free to share with your colleagues. If you'd like to submit any questions for future episodes, email me at pys@heyinfluent.com.